Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 19 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises in March 1759, somewhere on the border of Norfolk and Suffolk. 12 women are separately carrying on with household chores. One is scrubbing the floor with sand and brushes. One is carrying pails of water on a yoke. Another is mending a dress. Several are doing different stages of laundry, and one is changing a screaming baby. There is no dialogue, just the sounds of their labor. What is clear is that a lot of hard work is being done, and that this work will continue to be done as a matter of daily course for these women and many more like them. This is the opening tableau of Lucy Kirkwood's play, The Welkin, which sets the social context for what will be both a shocking historical thriller, a tense courtroom drama, and a compelling commentary on the burdens that women carry in a patriarchal world of any age. The Welkin premiered at the National Theatre in London in January 2020 with a marvelous female cast and directed by James MacDonald. Very cruelly, the play's run was cut short by the first COVID lockdown in March last year, as it happens just days before I was booked to see it. I dearly hope that it will return to the stage as soon as the theaters are able to reopen. But for now, I'm excited to have the opportunity to explore the play today with none other than the play's author, who's joining me from her home, I think in East Anglia. Hello, Lucy.
Hi, Doug. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for giving us the time. I must do a proper introduction. Lucy Kirkwood's previous plays include her acclaimed breakthrough Chimerica, which dramatized in stunning visual stagecraft the relationship between China and America through the iconic photograph of the Tiananmen Square protests. The play won an Olivier Award for Best Play in 2014 and was expanded into a 4-part TV drama by Lucy herself. Her next play, The Children, produced at the Royal Court in 2016, and also directed by James MacDonald, is a thought-provoking and moving story of love and friendship set in an apocalyptic world following an unspecified environmental disaster, which unexpectedly now has echoes of the pandemic we are currently living through. Lucy's last play before The Welkin, Mosquitoes, starring Olivia Colman and Olivia Williams, was staged by the National Theatre in 2017. Mosquitoes combines a family drama with the science of particle physics and is typical of the ambition, variety, and emotional power of Lucy's work, which explores large ideas and themes through moving personal stories. So it is with The Welkin. So welcome again, Lucy. The formal bit over. So I said at the beginning, the play is an historical play set in 1759. For listeners who weren't lucky enough to see it during the short run or haven't had the chance to read it yet, I wonder if we could start by giving them a brief synopsis of what the premise and plot of the play is.
Yes, so the play, after that tableau of housework, the play starts properly with the arrival home of a young woman called Sally Poppy in the middle of the night to her husband, and we sort of slowly understand that she's recently done a bunk and has run away with a mysterious stranger and has returned tonight covered in blood. And the rest of the play follows through whether that blood is to do with the fact she's been an accomplice in a very hideous murder of a child who's the small daughter of the local sort of landed family who live in the big house and whom pretty much everyone in this area is probably economically dependent on in some way or form. And so we move from that to a courtroom drama that is about 12 women, 12 matrons, women who've had children being gathered to assess whether Sally is pregnant or not, because there's no question whether she's guilty or not. According to the judicial system of the day, they've decided she is. What these women are given the gift of is deciding whether, when she pleads the belly and says, "You can't hang me because I'm pregnant," whether she's telling the truth or not about that. But inevitably, of course, this is the small pocket of power these women are given, but inevitably they fall to discussing whether she's really done it or not, why she might have done it, why she might not have done it, all those things. So it's But the key relationship in the play is between Sally and Elizabeth Luke, who's the local midwife, who is called upon at the last minute to be the final member of the jury on account of her experience as the local midwife. And she's very reluctant, she's very cynical about this process. She doesn't think it has I think she's got issues with the science of it and the politics of it, and she's not keen to be involved, particularly when she learns who the accused is. She is very concerned not to be involved, but I think the realization that the understanding that every other person in that jury is apparently against Sally moves her to come and try and be spokeswoman for the girl. And so then the rest of the play is playing that out.
Yes, well, as you say, it sounds like an almost impossible thing to adjudicate, though. I don't know how they're supposed to decide, because Sally is in the early stages of pregnancy. It's not obvious, but they somehow have to determine this. I wanted to ask you about the structure of the play, too, because after that opening, and you say there's this wonderfully vivid scene where Sally returns to her husband, who she's left for some other man, I guess, but seems to have been involved in a crime, is covered in blood, and we don't know what it is, but it's a very dramatic and quite shocking scene. And then what follows, as you describe, is almost like an extended courtroom drama. And I wondered whether there were a specific model for that for you. I mean, obviously, 12 Angry Men, you talked about the role of the midwife, Lizzie, who's one of the main characters, and who initially stands out against many of the other so-called jurors who believe that she's automatically guilty and should hang. Then, of course, the model might be 12 Angry Men, and this is 12 Angry Women. Did you have that kind of model in mind when you structured it?
I mean, I'm a great admirer of the Lumet film in particular, but I think when I started writing it, I'd come across during my research this idea of the jury of matrons, and I was so taken with it, and I thought immediately there's a theatrical form there. And I think part of the mission became, how is it not like 12 Angry Men? Because I knew that comparison was readily available, and I sort of wanted to fight for the piece of work to be its own thing rather than a sort of ladies' version of a male classic. So that sort of became the mission, all the ways it's not that. Yeah, the real references are probably feel slightly more oblique to anyone on the outside of the process. But one of the big influences on the opening of the show in particular was a 70s thriller called The Parallax View, a Warren Beatty film, which has got this amazing shot that sort of tracks in closer and closer and closer, zooms in closer and closer and closer to this sort of judicial hearing. And there's this, the whole shot is kind of black, and it just goes, and you hear this sort of voice of God over the top of it, basically ruling out the fact there's been any foul play in something. It's a conspiracy thriller, and it's basically looking at the ways that this conspiracy has been covered up by the cogs of power. So that was a real influence. And I was really keen for the beginning of the play to have this sort of, just to hit the ground running and to feel like we've obviously got that tableau, but after that there's for it to just take you like a thriller, for it to just, so those were the kind of references that I had, were plays and films to some extent that do that.
Yes, well, it does have that tension of a thriller, certainly the opening, but then throughout, as a courtroom drama, there's sort of an inevitable suspense.
Yeah.
And the way I love courtroom drama, and the way those evolve usually is a slow burn in terms of discovering more about who the characters are, the principals, the defendant, but also some of the jury members and what their perspective on the world is and on the case. And you do that beautifully through the play.
Well, what makes this unusual, I think, in terms of the setup for it, is that I don't think there's any other courtroom drama, or certainly jury drama, where the defendant's allowed to be in the room, which is a bit of a gift. You know, what if you're sitting in a room with Myra Hindley is an extraordinarily potent proposition, I think.
That's really good point. You know what? I hadn't even considered that. And yet it's a vital relationship, as we'll talk about the character of the defendant, Sally, and how she responds to the jurors while they're debating her case right in front of her. And as you say, there's something about the justice system. I think there's a note you have in the text as a prelude to the text that talks about the voice of justice being a disembodied voice. Mm-hmm. Of course, that's one of the themes would seem to be that the wheels of justice, the institutions largely controlled by men, of course, are not necessarily designed by logic or certainly in the interests of the women.
And not just, I mean, I'd say that the important thing, I think we always miss out in conversation about patriarchy, is it's not just on gender lines. I don't think it's women and the economically disempowered.
Yes.
I don't think we're talking about, when we're talking about the patriarchy now, we're not really talking strictly about gender, but it's just got that little Latin root in it that makes us think we are.
Well, that's interesting because, of course, the principals in the play, the women in the play, are also all largely working women. And I think that's obviously deliberate. And there's a point to that, which we'll talk a bit more about the social implications of that. I wanted to come back to the historical bit, because you talked about modern influences and references, but you choose to set the play specifically in 1759. Was there something significant about that date, that year?
Yeah, so 1759 is in historian circles known as an annus mirabilis for Britain, for England in particular, because we were in the midst of the 7 Years' War, and it was the year that we actually finally made these enormous victories in a way that makes it possible to argue for it being a really key year for our colonial expansion. And I think also an awful lot of British identity was sort of being formed. There's a song called Heart of Oak, which became a real English anthem, and lots of the lyrics to Rule Britannia have got sort of links back to those lyrics, and the idea of free men and not slaves, and we will fight and conquer again and again. So it surprises people when I say this, but I think of the play as my Brexit play, and for me it was a really key moment at which our national identity, as based around ideas of constant growth and expansion and conquering and English pride related to images of oak trees and all of that stuff, it was a real crucible for that. And I think, as I was writing this play in the years following 2016, I felt like we were still living really vividly with the legacy of that. And when I found out it was the year that Halley's Comet returned as well, that sort of synthesized with that for me in a sort of way I can't quite express. But there was just something about it as a year in which English identity was formed. And they have that conversation about the 7 Years' War in the play, and the fact that there's this colonial appetite is being whetted in that year in a way that is, when I make that point about the patriarchy, and it's also related to how we treat the rest of the world, and that was being birthed in that year to some extent.
Well, it's important to also say that the play is not just a historical recreation. There are definitely resonances of the modern world, and we'll talk about those more specifically. Interesting, 1759 is a talismanic date in the history of Canada, for example. So when I came across this date, it was immediately rang bells, because
Quebec was captured by the British in that year, right?
Correct. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham, where General James Wolfe defeated the French in 1759, meant that Canada became a British colony and not French. Pretty significant in the history of Canada. But I also wanted to ask you, so did you do lots of research to write the play? Because it does feel very authentic in period. As I say, it's not a costume drama. It doesn't feature just the aristocracy and bonnets and all that. Yet it feels wholly convincing for its period. So did you do a lot of research?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a bit of a research junkie, and I think perhaps a clearer-eyed version would be to say I'm very gifted at using research as procrastination. But there was a huge amount of research I did. But what was really lovely about this play was that the research sort of came in different channels of it. There was obviously the understanding that political context that we've just talked about a little bit. I really love sort of research that's just about what was daily life like, what was the texture of daily life, what did people eat, how did they wash, what did they put their baby when they needed to, all that stuff. So there was all of that, and there's lots of brilliant books out there like about that. There was also a whole pocket of research that I did, which was about reading about Fred and Rose West, for example, Myra Hindley, and women who are complicit in murders, and in horrible murders, particularly relating to children. There was a whole lot of linguistic research that was really enjoyable, both Georgian but also East Anglian, because in Norfolk and Suffolk have their own very distinct dialects and their ways of using language, and there were a couple of passes going through and making sure that all of that had its roots in reality, referencing that against a very strict rule I had with myself, which was that if you couldn't understand it immediately through context or sort of through instinct as an audience member, then I wasn't kind of putting in flowery language for the sake of it. I wasn't interested in that sort of coffee house version of Georgian that's about besting everyone with flowery epithets. And I was really concerned that the play it had to be immediate. It had to be something that a teenager sitting in the audience could understand every word of, even if they didn't know the word before they heard it.
I'm glad you raised that, because the language is part of what makes it feel authentic, and it feels very natural, a colloquial language, but with scatterings of vocabulary or dialect that seem very naturally of its period. And then actually I was going to ask you, particularly as we're talking about language, where the title comes from. I wasn't familiar with this word, the Welkin. What does it mean?
No, I came across it in the process of doing that research about language. I like titles that have got a kind of multiplicity of meaning. So I'll give you two, and I would say there's probably a few more in there. But one of them was simply, I'm really glad you started with that lovely description of the housework at the beginning of the show. And the Welkin means the highest part of the sky, or the highest part of heaven. It's an Empyrean word, and it's a word that means you look up. And one major seed of the play was wanting to write a play about housework and how consuming it is, and how it, if you think about it just on a physical level, it means you're looking down all day. You're looking down at the work in hand, you're looking down at the baby, you're looking down at the laundry, you're looking down at the washing up or the dishwasher, whatever it is, or hoover, the floor. And because the burden of housework has historically and continues largely to fall on women, what that does to your mental landscape, what kind of desires and drives and frustrations it creates in tension with that. And I'm always very interested in and seduced and taken with ideas to do with the sublime. And I think as well, being an artist who is a woman who has a lot of her day taken up with housework and looking after a baby and all those things, how you continue to create mental space for yourself to engage with the highest part of the sky. And to some extent, that's what Sally's done. Sally's rejected this very punishing life of looking after a fairly, I think, a nice man, but quite a dull man, and in a poor part of the world at a time when the price of bread is rising and wages are going down and the poor are feeling the crunch of enclosure and all of those things. She's rejected that to just go out on the road with someone who is clearly evil. He's someone who is very damaged and is reprehensible in terms of his actions and intents and the things he pulls Sally along with him. But he gives her ideas. He gives her enormous ideas about power and class and the and the empire, and she's engaging for the first time with something which feels enormous and seductive. And so the title really came with it. How does drudgery sit alongside the sublime? Like, and is that a tension in women's lives? And then the flip side of that, which you could also argue is the, you know, even invoking that word, the Welkin, we're talking about old-fashioned ideas of heaven or Christian ideas of heaven, which are really patriarchal, really hierarchical. There's a God at the top, there's all his archangels below, and then there's you, the little person, right at the bottom. In some ways, it's, as you said right at the beginning, it's an image of woman under patriarchy. It's something that sits over all of those women. There's just a system they're sitting in, and they're trying to do their best within it. And there are limits to that because the system is not designed for them.
Yes, I love the idea, though, of looking to the sky as a source of inspiration and hope. It's interesting. I was talking with my wife the other day about this, and she asked, why is it that cultures look to the sky for these symbols of hope? For example, the definitions of heaven, or that, you know, we read our fate in the stars or worship the sun. And of course, specifically, you have the comet. You mentioned just earlier that 1759 happened to be the year, one of the years that Halley's Comet appears in the sky. It happens every 75 years. But of course, comets are often seen as portents of life-changing events, as we've seen in Shakespeare and others. So there is a significance to looking up. But I love the idea, hadn't occurred to me, of course, about the women's focus looking down, and therefore even more specifically and even physically offering a potential for an alternative, for inspiration or hope. So they do, through the play, look to the sky, particularly with regard to whether Halley's Comet will appear and what that might signify.
Well, particularly this part, just that's a really good question to your wife, because it makes the point that it is a universal instinct we have to look up. But the play is set in East Anglia, and East Anglia is a landscape that you know, Noel Cowardly famously described as very flat. But that's it. What you get is these enormous skies. That all the drama is in the sky because the land is so flat. And particularly this year, I think, given lockdown and how much time I've spent outside walking around with the baby, and there are certainly like late afternoons, evenings here where the cloud formations in particular, you look at it and you go, I understand why early people conceived ideas of heaven, because the way the clouds sit, the colors on the clouds, there's a kingdom up there. There is a kingdom up there, and it's beautiful. Like, and it's good.
Absolutely. Well, also the other suggestion my wife made was that, of course, it's the source of weather.
Yes.
And we are so utterly dependent on the weather and its forces, and they are mysterious to us and greater than us. And like you, actually, we were in East Anglia in Norfolk in September for a few days, and every evening, one of the things that just captured us is we would sit, there was a conservatory in the place we were renting, and we would just watch the sky and the sun, the clouds and the sun as it started to set, and the variety of that. And somehow, of course, living on the outskirts of London as I do, I didn't see the sky in the same way
No.
as it did when I was out there. So it's a really great specific reference. I was going to ask you about the cast of characters. What is amazing about the play as well is that there are no shortage of these women. There's 12 of them by definition on the jury that form the matrons of the jury in the play. They're all, as I said a while back, generally working women. And I think you had a note that suggested that when you're performing the play, the matrons could be of any ethnic background, but that it was crucial the group reflected the present day population of the place the play is being performed in. I thought that was really striking. What was your intention with that direction?
Well, it was partly, we still live in a time, you made a reference earlier to the fact it doesn't feel like a sort of dusty period drama with bonnets and, fans fluttering. And that was always just on an aesthetic level. I mean, I love period drama, but on an aesthetic level, I felt like James and Bunny delivered such a beautiful production that was exactly what I wanted in terms of it feeling fairly crisp and modern, and it wasn't hiding behind all this paraphernalia. And equally, there is something that still happens with the best, we have such brilliant casting directors in the theatre in this country, and we have such, directors, I think, who really understand the need for diversity in casting. But there's something that happens, I think, when you say a drama is historical, that people just go on this autopilot slightly sometimes. So it was about being really clear to anyone picking up this play with the intention to direct it that this isn't a white play, just because we're used to this type of play being white. And beyond that, it's exactly what it says on the tin. It's the need for the play to reflect whoever's sitting in the audience. And I think that's really important. It's important for every play, but it's important to remind people of that when they're watching something about an era they perceive there not to have been people of colour in, or people, that's really important to me.
I thought the also thing is that it's a wonderful range of distinctive individual characters, and I'm just in awe of someone who can create this many different identities. And what you do that's very cleverly, I think, in the play is what's called the empaneling scene, where the women are formally sworn in as part of the jury. And as in so doing, each of them are given a brief speech where they introduce themselves, and it becomes a sort of concise character sketch. It's incredibly efficient exposition.
My favorite bit to write, I think. I really enjoyed it.
I noticed that, I guess partly for the time, but I don't know whether this is just of its time, that almost invariably when they're introducing themselves, they identify themselves by their family circumstances, the number of children they had, or their marriage or not. Their definitions seem to be dependent on that kind of identity, whether they had husbands and the challenges of their domestic lives or their family lives, which of course says something about women's place in society, that they're simply defined by their relationship to the men. I mean, I'm sure you were conscious of this, but that this kind of thing seems to dominate their world.
Yeah, that's what they've been called there because the qualification for being there that day is that they've had children.
Yes, okay.
So there's a sort of here's what I'm bringing to the pod, but also they were defined by their marriages and their children to some extent, because that was the extent of the ambition available to them. And I think that's something that remains, actually. I think that Helen is a character who I have a lot of connection with, and I think a lot of people. I think if you said to a woman who is struggling to conceive, or we live in an age when women aren't defined by their ability to have children, then they would contest that, and they would say, actually, I feel strongly that it's very possible to have a full and happy life without children if you want them, but as a culture, women in particular, I think, struggle to break away from the idea that you should have children, or I think probably partly to do with the menopause and the fact that there's a date that stops being available to you, whereas as Nora Ephron famously wrote, Charlie Chaplin was having babies when he was 90.
Yes. Yes. Well, Helen, you mentioned Helen. It's an amazing character because she's had, she says, 12 miscarries and one stillborn baby in 8 years, but she's still very happily married, which not all the women are.
Hardly any of them.
No, exactly. There's Sarah, I think she's 83 years old, had 21 children by 3 husbands, all very satisfactory, she says.
Yeah.
But as you say, many of them are identified by the number of children and how happy or not they are in their domestic relationship. Interestingly, Lizzie and Sally are the 2 main characters who seem to challenge a lot of the convention or the orthodoxy of this, though. Sally, we talked about earlier, about her being in the courtroom with all the others. And Initially, I guess the structure of a courtroom drama like this would be that you have some sympathy. I think we have some natural sympathy, maybe predisposition for the defendant, particularly if they're going to be hung. And if she's a young woman and we're not certain about what happened in the crime, we haven't been given all of the detail yet. However, Sally doesn't behave in a way that garners our sympathy. And she doesn't behave in that way towards the other jurors either when she's with them. She's pretty unlikable. She's very bitter and angry and lashes out at them. She's very hostile to the very people who hold her fate in her hands. So it becomes harder to sympathize with. And then we even discover, of course, that she is actually complicit in the murder and doesn't even seem to have the suitable contrition. I wondered why you drew her like this. Why is she a difficult character in that sense?
So two reasons. One is, I'm really glad you asked this. The first is to do with, I think, probably a few years now working with Clean Break. And I will say, to start with, the vast number of women that I met through that organisation, who are women who are in prison or have come through the criminal justice system.
Can I just interrupt, Lizzie? Tell us a little bit about who Clean Break are.
Clean Break's a theatre company, and I'm a patron now, but I've been on the board for a good few years, and I taught there before, and they commissioned my play about sex trafficking, If I Empty When the Heart Went at First, but it is all right now. They work with women who are either currently in the criminal justice system or have left the criminal justice system and are trying to gain qualifications or education, and it's a really brilliant organisation. And most of the women I met through Clean Break they're brilliant, charming, funny women. I had something that happened quite early on when I was teaching a workshop in a prison, and one of the women in the group, no one had to be there, they'd signed up voluntarily, and one of the women was being incredibly disruptive to the point of pretty unpleasant. I was not a very seasoned teacher, I'm still not a very seasoned teacher, and I sort of kept kind of trying to work out how to deal with this. And eventually I said, look, you don't need to be here if you don't want to be here. And the behaviour just kept getting worse and worse and worse, and finally the warden took her out. And at that point, a number of the other women said to me, oh, she was so keen to do this workshop, but her child was being adopted today. And I'd been sitting there just thinking, this woman's such a pain in the arse, and why she bothered to sign up. And actually just that was a dramatisation for me of the fact that once you're a victim of crime or abuse, or you are in the criminal justice system for whatever reason, it's a cycle. I think, and we often want our victims to be perfect victims, and we want them to behave in morally gleaming ways. And we see this a lot in rape trials, but we see it at every level, I think. And the problem is, I think, that women often who are brutalized by society act in a way which is unappealing, and we especially want women to be appealing all the time. We want them to smile and be pleasant.
Yes.
So it was really important to me that Sally was sort of the sharp end of a real version of a woman who'd we learn from the first scene that her husband beats her up. By the way, I was really careful because the male actors in the play were just fantastic, and they did such beautiful, subtle readings of those men. And I think it was really important to me that I don't think Fred is like an unusually unpleasant husband for the age. I think he uses physical violence as a way of controlling his wife, but I don't think that was necessarily out of the ordinary at the time. But we know that she is beaten up. We know that there's been some, I suspect, incest in her background. So she gets to the age of 19, 20, and she's kind of unpleasant in lots of ways. And of course she is. So that was really important. And then the second slightly more mischievous answer is that I have a revulsion of theatre that makes it easy for a left-wing audience. I think it's really important, and I'm somewhere to the left of Keir Starmer, but I think it's really important that we make it hard, that we don't just go, women are brilliant, yay, it's in fact quite dangerous. And what I want is the person who sits in the audience and reads The Spectator to be persuaded, and or at least to not think it's some piece of whitewash. That's an important role of theatre, is to, a cathedral of people in one room who come from all different political leanings, and hopefully they have a unity of experience.
Yes, well, it's fascinating to hear about the background from Clean Break, and because psychologically this is a very real character, and as you referenced, she has had her challenges in her upbringing. And then it leads her to a view of the world, which I think is quite challenging and very interesting. And she expresses this quite explicitly a couple of times. There's once where she's this man who she's followed, who was convicted of the murder with her, says at one stage, if someone robs off you, you can rob off them. And if anyone has more than you, that's only because they've robbed you a long time ago. So you can rob them too. And in a way, it's very simple-minded logic, but it sounds pretty persuasive. And if you talk about social inequality, accept that and you think, but actually that leads to lawless anarchy, of course.
Yeah, but I suppose the point is to suggest the process by which they were robbed a while ago was not lawless anarchy to begin with. And because that lawless anarchy was committed by people of power and wealth, it's not given the label of lawless anarchy. It's given the, the name of like economic growth.
Oh, of course. And there's that just reminded me completely inappropriately, but of a Bob Dylan line where there's something about if you rob a little, they'll throw you in prison. If you rob a lot, they'll make you a king.
Right.
But what I was thinking also was about what the psychological drive for her is in terms of this anger of hers and how she ultimately participates in this horrible crime. What fuels her to commit this crime is something to do with anger about the inequalities of the world, isn't it?
Well, that's a really good question, because actually I would argue that what Thomas has is quite a coherent rage about the inequalities of the world. And what he gives her is, he gives her those ideas as a way of dignifying something which is less dignified, or understanding. And I think she has a huge amount of rage about the class system and how she's been treated during her life, which are related to the class system and economic inequality and all of those things. But I don't think she can articulate them like that until she meets Thomas.
Right.
So we do know that she's been fired for stealing something that I think she did steal, but she also feels really angry. I think she has developed, working in that house, has developed a huge amount of class rage, and of that watching a small girl get treated, the fact that child's got a ruby on her finger is outrageous to her, given that she's probably having to make compromises about how much butter they're buying every week, all of those things. I mean, I would argue a bit like, this isn't a comparison the play is trying to make particularly, but I will make it, is the way that the Brexit vote became a sort of Trojan horse for a lot of different rages.
Yes.
It became, here's what you're really angry at. You're angry at the EU. No, I'm not really. I'm angry at the fact that the fishing industry has been destroyed, and I'm angry at the fact that XYZ. But okay, I'll make this vote, and that will make me feel like I have. Sorry, I don't mean to patronise people who voted for Leave. Like, lots of people voted knowing exactly what they're voting for, but I think there's a lot of people who were invited to pour their rages about other things into this.
There's another element I was going to say, I thought while you were talking, I'd forgotten to mention, in terms of her anger at the injustice. As you said, she's been a specific victim of, but also that she's in love with and enthralled in a really powerful sense with this man, yeah. Which just again flashed through my head, reminding me of Bonnie and Clyde. I'm thinking of the film.
Yeah.
Bonnie somehow ends up kind of enthralled in passionate terms, in love with, and therefore is led off the garden path.
That's a really important point, Doug. I think that she feels, Myra Hindley was really in love with Ian Brady. She was deeply in love. Fred and Rose West were deeply in love with each other. Both of them, I think, lost their virginity to a parent. So you combine like fairly hideous childhoods with meeting someone who is also perhaps unstable in certain ways, falling in love with them, and the passion and the power of that, and you have a kind of horrible chemistry experiment, I think.
Yes. Actually, now I wanted to turn to Lizzie, because she's also a challenging figure. Initially, we think she's going to be, and she is in a lot of ways, remains the moral center of the play, I think. She adopts this role like the Henry Fonda role in 12 Angry Men. You think she's going to be the one who's whiter than white somehow and is going to convince all the others about the real truths. But she's, again, more ambiguous character than that, because she's not naturally collegiate with lots of the other women. She keeps a truth about Sally to herself throughout the whole of the deliberations. And there's one stage where she even attacks one of the other jurors. So there's some complexity to her character and our relationship with her. And in fact, with her relationship with her community, which I also thought was fascinating, because she is the midwife. So in some cases, the women have had personal experience with her that's very positive, helped them give birth to their children. In others, things may have not have gone well and they hold it against her. And she's also, I think, a healer of some sort, so that there's always this sense of mystery about her. There's this unknown. People don't really understand, of course, in that age what she does, and think she may have mysterious powers, perhaps even, I don't know, that are not trustworthy. So she's both a necessary and welcome member of the community, but also potentially an outcast from the normal community as well. So how do you see Lizzie as a character?
You've just done such a brilliant synopsis of it. No, it's great. It's great to hear. Often it's when you hear people talk about things and the mirror looks slightly warped, you're like, oh my god, but that's exactly, she is one of the characters. We did explicitly reference 12 Angry Men when we were discussing her, and James McDonald and I would often say she's much more interesting when the white suit gets grubby.
Yes.
Henry Fonda wears that white suit throughout that, but actually Lizzie to me was always much more interesting when she was more morally dubious and she wasn't always on the side of the angels, and there was something either secretive or deceptive or even self-serving at times about her behaviour. And you've described really well the sort of amazing privilege and terrible power and dangerous power of being that role at that time, because when Charlotte starts throwing around veiled accusations of witchcraft, that's a really dangerous energy for her to put in the room for that woman at that time. That's something which Lizzie will have worked hard, I think, to have protected herself from. And that must have been very hard to do, particularly given her personal politics, which we see from the play. She's not that brilliant at sort of hiding and doffing her cap. So she's also kind of she's such a realist, I think. She's dealt with the realities of women's bodies and loads of different male bodies too, I suspect. She's a medical practitioner. But we meet her at a moment that is really high stakes for historically, because this is the sort of part of the 18th century when midwifery and childbirth, being a female province, is starting to become colonised, really, I suppose, by male science, by those doctors up in Edinburgh who were doing drawings of the womb for the first time. And we get that a bit with our doctor who arrives, and he's got his speculum and he's got these kind of implements, and he's got an academic scientific knowledge, which some of which, by the way, is going to save a lot of lives over the course of centuries. And so again, it's not about, he's kind of we had quite a lot of fun with him, but he's not an entirely ridiculous figure. He's the progress of medical science is going to stop a lot of women dying in childbirth, but it's not Lizzie's fault they're dying in childbirth. She's just doing her absolute best, but she doesn't know about things like sanitation or she doesn't know about washing her hands. She doesn't know about all those things, and so she's in a really precarious position. And that's always the most interesting moment to meet a character, is when they're under threat, under pressure.
I thought that's really interesting, because the women weirdly seem to trust when, as you say, the male doctor is called in to try and adjudicate the situation. And many of the women trust the male doctor more than Lizzie, which seems paradoxical. And actually interesting, you talk about the character of the male doctor. Again, I'm sure there was a temptation. I thought immediately, oh, he's going to be a caricature, but he's not. He does betray his time in that he thinks, well, there's some lines about how it must have been down to menstruation because women go completely mad and can't be accountable for their action at that time. But on the other hand, he actually does come up with the right decisions at the time. Yeah. Although it's interesting, as you say, about how little was known about women's bodies then, perhaps even now.
Yeah.
There's a line that says, I do think it very queer that we know more about the movement of a comet that is thousands of miles away than the workings of a woman's body. And that reminded me of, I don't know whether you've come across a book called Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez, which is a fabulously eye-opening expose of how data bias in our world designed for men disadvantages women, especially in the understanding of women's health. So even today, anatomy textbooks are largely represent a male body as standard, and women's bodies are presented as a variation to this standard. And medical research has largely been carried out on men, with the resulting diagnoses and drugs failing to match women's needs. It's still going on in that sense.
Absolutely. I've just come through a year where a huge number of my peers have had babies, and in particularly trying circumstances. And there's this huge rainbow. I can't think of one of them who hasn't had some sort of really difficult complication in some way. And I continue to feel that if men had the babies, the research would have been done a long time ago as to how to mitigate against such complications.
Absolutely. I mean, you're unsparing, I think, in the play about these women's physical lives, about what they endure in childbirth or menstruation or their physical health, sexual or physical abuse. I mean, just as we said earlier, the burden of repeated pregnancy, that some woman who's had multiple miscarriages or 21 children. There's a somewhat funny, but all too serious possibly line about contraception. And one of the methods was to keep a piece of brick and a handkerchief under the bed. And that was it. Seemed necessary at the time, however. I also wanted to ask you about the play also reminded me, I don't know whether this makes sense, of the Crucible, partly because of the historical setting and the trial at the center of the play, but also because of you touched on it about witchcraft and things, the importance of religion and superstition in these worlds. You mentioned there was a reference to the trial of a witch even in the Welkin, but is it not that the play is something about what people believe in? Because there seem to all sorts of different things that these characters believe in. Was that something you wanted to explore?
Yeah, I always think people are desperate to believe in things. Like people always look, and that's what's, I mean, for me with Sally's been someone who's just suddenly found something to believe in. And like, unfortunately, the thing she's found to believe in is the religion of Thomas, which is a murderous one, is a hideous one. The other thing about the Crucible, and it's a reference I've heard a lot, but I felt it myself when I was writing it, because I've just got such great admiration for that play in terms of how it operates like a modern thriller. That play starts and you just go, at the end of every single act, something just goes woomph, woomph, woomph. And it's just so beautifully constructed, that play. Yeah, I just think it's an absolutely exquisitely made object.
Yes, but it also captures some of the other worldly forces, though, doesn't it? It's not utterly naturalistic at times, but I don't want to go too far off onto the Crucible. But I wondered about, for example, the things that you suggest people believe in the play. There's obviously God. There's lots of references to it's God's will, and whether we blame God or the devil, of course. They very strongly believe that the devil's real, that the devil probably occupies Sally and Thomas, that they're evil. And there are references to even Lizzie being the form of the devil when is that right?
Right, yes.
I mean, I meant just generally that I wondered how you wanted to treat religion in the play. How did you want to present what religion meant to these women?
Well, religion is a really helpful, at that time, I think, particularly thinking about those women, that was what they had available to them to process their experiences. So what's happened in the woods with Sarah is, I think she's had an episode of postnatal psychosis, which is much less rare than you think it is. And the way she has been able to process that is by telling a story in the way that with a character they all know. It's like if I had a nervous breakdown and I tried to explain it through characters from EastEnders. That's the language they had. That's the structure. That's the structure they had through which to process their experience. Is this Christian imagery and these ideas, because when I invoke the devil, you all understand what I'm talking about. Is how she's processed it for herself, because she's had to come to terms with the fact she almost drowned her baby. And when her mental weather returned to a more clement state, she was probably completely horrified by herself and terrified by her ability to do that. The idea that you could do that for a mother must be terrifying once your brain has sorted itself out. So she's had to find a way for herself to understand what led her to do that, and it's helpful to our brains if we can outsource our worst impulses to exterior forces rather than bits of ourselves, isn't it? So
yes, it wasn't us. We were consumed. We were overtaken by some external.
And that's what makes Sally noble, by the way. I think that's why whatever she's unforgivable in so many ways that we've discussed, but in that big speech, what she does is take responsibility for the very worst part of herself.
Yes, and in both Sally, as you mentioned, both Sally and Lizzie, however, challenge, I think, the religious orthodoxy as well, don't they? I mean, there's a moment when the women pray together and Lizzie does not take part. And in fact, she says at one point to them, challenges them, says, it's not God's authority that is called upon here. You have been given a power. Why are you afeard to use it? And Sally early on says to her husband, when he says God should forgive her, and he says, no, well, God isn't up there. He's inside us, in our bodies. And then she says at another point, I've been to look at God, presumably inside herself. But these are attitudes to religion that are perhaps more modern than the rest of the women from their time. Because the other things they believe in, as you said, witchcraft isn't far away, because there's all these old wives' tales, things like there's a lovely bit where they're trying to decipher whether Sally's pregnant, and they all talk about those things that might be tells as to whether you're pregnant or not, your food fetishes or whatever it might be.
That research was done on Mumsnet. That's still everyone does that now. it's a continuous thing.
Well, there were countless of them. It was brilliant. But what I also thought was interesting about, by extension, with all these religious beliefs and superstitions, is how it can lead to our adopting fixed views of the world, so that Sally becomes evil. It's easy to it's a shorthand then to be able to label people and to make judgments. So I wondered whether that was part of what you were intending, is the play is also about how we hold our prejudices and predispositions and how they inform how we behave towards others.
Absolutely. I mean, we just had a really acute example of this. This awful case, the final execution that Trump has pushed through, and you read what she did, and it's absolutely hideous. It's almost impossible to read it without being completely revulsed. But when you read what her life was, like, it was unbearable. It just sounds like her life was a living hell. And as we mentioned earlier, that's what happens when people are brutalized, is they become brutal. And especially, I think, when you throw children, I mean, it's quite important to me that the victim was a child, because that's something that short circuits everyone. The minute it's a child, you just. So I suppose I just tried to challenge myself to justify the murder of a child all the way through, and I don't think it ever is justified, but I think I understand why Sally believes it is.
Yes, that makes the morality of the judgments very challenging, but you do definitely challenge, I think, some of the predispositions. I mean, most of the matrons have made up their mind about her before the debate starts, and it comes from various predispositions. It might be just their social view of her, their family, the upbringing, oh, they're a bad lot, or they've had something specifically has happened between them, therefore they hold it against her. Mm-hmm. But it was interesting was that there's a moment when they're trying to determine if she's pregnant and whether she can produce breast milk. And she apparently does produce a bit of breast milk, but then the women don't really accept this. And Lizzie challenges them and says, you cannot mean to ignore the truth simply because that's inconvenient to you. Now, again, that line seemed to just jump out at me and resonate with our world, doesn't it, Lucy? I mean, yeah. Trump's alternative facts or Brexiteers ignoring the experts. Did you have the politics of our time in mind when?
Yeah, completely. That's what I do find frightening about the deluge of information we all are subsumed by these days, because it is possible to justify any view you want, because the wealth of opinion and fact and the misreporting of facts and our inability to meaningfully grade information. I think it's like if you want to prioritize something you've read on Facebook over what the 10 o'clock news is saying, then we live in a world now where that's possible for you to do that somehow, and I find that really terrifying, and I find it. I can't quite envision the solution to it. I can't work out how you reel back from that, how you have an internet which is policed in any way.
It also seems to, exasperate the idea that we have our fixed opinions, and then we end up only within the echo chamber of those who agree with us on social media. I thought was interesting, again, the echoes seem to be all over the place with how it feels relevant today. Outside the courthouse, while all this is going on, there's an angry mob who are waiting to witness the hanging. They want to see this woman hung. And I was struck by the anger of the mob. And one of the matrons, Emma, describes the vitriol of the mob outside and says, there's a moral slippage in this country I find most troubling. And I mean, this week, or these weeks of all things, I couldn't help but think of the storming of the Capitol in Washington and this mob seeking to take the law into their own hands. And I wondered how deliberately you wanted to reference this kind of anger, collective anger. Why is it we're so angry? A lot of people are fueled by anger, as you mentioned, I guess, in Brexit, why they were fueled by anger, but also that the institutions may even be vulnerable, because without giving too much away, the justice system here takes one course, but the mob can overtake that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. But I think that is a symptom of the official processes in democratic institutions, not people feeling like they've not been served properly by them. I think the Capitol violence is the result of a bunch of other stuff. As Carol Churchill has ever sort of summed up the moment, it was terrible rage, terrible rage, terrible rage, terrible rage. That's there, and what do you do with it? And the thing I felt watching the footage of that Capitol violence was, this is the unarmed version. And lots of the people who feel these feelings have got guns, and I don't know what the next stage looks like, and that's really frightening.
It is. I love the way there are so many elements about the play. I talked about at the very beginning about this not just being historical reenactment, but that touches our modern world, and we've just been talking about some of them. But there are some very specific devices, I think, in the play that do this effectively. One of which is that there's a lovely scene where you show Sally playing with the little girl who she's about to abduct. It's sort of chilling because it's an image of innocence, but we know the violent crime that's going to follow. But she tells the story about playing with this little girl, and she describes the game as aeroplanes. And in the flow of her speech, I may not even notice that this is an anachronism for 1759. However, Lizzie asks her a few lines later, what is aeroplanes? Incidentally, another object to be seen in the sky, which I just thought was absolutely beautiful. But obviously, this is a deliberately contemporary reference in this historical play. Why did you do that?
That's one of the bits I'm wary of talking too much about, because I like that it is a provocation for people to sit and think about it, but it is a filament that reminds you that this is not a historical drama to some extent. It's a little like a glittering kind of plumb line between 1759 and whatever year you're sitting in the theatre watching the play. And it's just that. And again, as you've mentioned, like it's up in the air, isn't it? It's what's flying through the sky now.
I love the idea that it just resonates. You don't make a big deal of it, but it somehow lifts you out of its time. And another one was the women at one stage start singing, and I don't know how many people recognize, but probably quite a lot of people recognize this is a Kate Bush song that they sing. It's not some period piece. So again, what are you doing? Why particularly this Kate Bush song, by the way? I have to think, because every decision a playwright makes must be very deliberate. So what was it about this song?
Well, it was a moment of unity in the play for them all, because there's such a lot of friction between all of them, and they all kind of, even the ones who think the same thing think it for different reasons, and people have got their different sets of prejudices that overlap like Venn diagrams, and there's all sorts of differences between all of them. But I wanted there to be this moment of unity, and I particularly wanted that moment of unity to come as a moment of healing for Helen. It was really important to me to protect that character and dignify her and care for her. And so in a way, me making them all sing to her is sort of me getting them all to look after her in that awful moment that she's had. So I started thinking I want them to sing, and also for it to be kind of like a work song. When we started doing research into what laundry was at that time, it's a whole day of work, and a lot of the time you're standing in the river or you're hauling water, buckets and buckets of water, and it's a really lengthy, arduous process, and I think a fair bit of singing would have happened during it, and so I wanted it to have the tone of a work song. But when I started researching those songs, none of them sort of connected to it at all for me, and I've always loved that song, and the song to me is about it's about, I think, according to Kate Bush, it's to a man and a woman trying to exchange experiences, but on a greater level, it felt to me as being a song about empathy, and about if I could understand what it was to be you and you could understand what it was to be me. And I think that the entire play is about trying to generate what are the things that get in the way of the generation of empathy, and how patriarchy encourages us to shut down channels of empathy, because it makes it easier to categorize things and makes very difficult decisions much easier. So I think there's just such a beautiful kind of summoning of empathy in that song.
Well, obviously it also does the same thing as airplanes, in the sense it lodges in us this sense of it's not just the past, but as you say, very specifically, I had to go away and look up this song, Running Up That Hill, Kate Bush, and listen to it and see what the lyrics were about. And as you say, if only I could, I'd make a deal with God and get him to swap our places. And there was an interview with Kate where she said that it was really about a man and woman can't understand each other because we're a man and woman. And if we could actually swap each other's roles, we'd actually be in each other's place for a while. We'd have a better understanding. It seems pretty emblematic of the play itself, in the sense of it's largely what I take away is about the perspective of the place of women in society over many generations, and that particularly the working women, because at the very end you come back to the women working. The tableau at the beginning is repeated, but it's 2061, which happens to be the next date Halley's Comet will return, and the women are performing the domestic chores again wordlessly, but these are more modern domestic chores that we would recognize in our world, carrying grocery shopping or watching TV and ironing, and one of them has got a mobile phone in their hand while breastfeeding, I think. So that brings us bang up to date. And that's the vision you take away, isn't it, of the women's survival in their ordinary lives, what the burdens they're carrying and continuing to carry. And not a lot has changed over that time.
No, yeah, well, yeah, and we actually made care, like when we did, I can't remember if it made it into the script, but when we were staging it, a lot more of those women had their partners in the background helping them do that. But statistically, the burden of housework still overwhelmingly falls on women. And actually this year, if you look at the statistics about homeschooling this year and working from home and all of those things, and how there's been a really profound gender divide. So the idea that we're beyond those divisions, I think, is not a correct one. There's a long way to go.
I was just going to say that reminded me again of the invisible women, because one of the themes of the book is the invisible labor carried out by women in all sorts of ways. I think the last thing I wanted to ask you about was the ending. Without giving away spoilers, there's a moment where Lizzie and Sally and Emma are left. At one stage, they look up to the sky, as we started with at the beginning. And I wondered what that signified to you, because it's not a conventionally happy ending or resolution, but there is something, isn't there not, in looking to the sky?
Yeah, well, I think certainly like there's a moment of release that's about to happen for Sally, certainly. Like, as I said, I think the play, perhaps in a glancing way, but offers you lots of reasons that her life, her childhood, her adolescence has probably been fairly hideous in lots of ways. And I think that she's certainly come to some degree of a cul-de-sac in her life, and so the options available to that woman are narrowing by the second, and the one that is offered to her in the end during the ending of the play is one which, a release is the word we kept using in rehearsal when we were working on that moment, was just that there was a sort of exhalation to it. That was the feeling of it, was like, oh, like it almost being an act of mercy.
Yes. Also, there's a specific image of the comet in the sky as the symbol of change or hope or whatever you dream for, I think.
Yes, but also it's not there. I don't think it's there. I think it's being used like the dentist uses, look at the birdie. Like it's using the comet like you use a rattle with a child.
Oh, don't say that. I like the idea of the comet. We all like the idea of the comet.
Yes, it's lovely. And but I suppose what the end of the play proposes is it not the act of looking for it in the sky that is the fulfilling thing, not the seeing of it?
Exactly. Quite right. That's a great note to end on. We've run out of time. But before I let you go, Lucy, one of the traditions of the podcast is I like to ask my guests to recommend a play that we could talk about in a future episode. So I wonder, is there a personal favorite that you'd happy to nominate?
I've been looking forward to this bit. I had lots of contenders, but I would like to nominate Disappeared by Phyllis Nage.
Ooh, I don't know this. Great.
One of my favourite writers.
Tell me a bit about it.
It's about the disappearance of a young woman who was last seen in a bar talking to a slightly odd man, and the whole play investigates, I think, the ideas of like our quest for the sublime, our quest for something beyond, in ways which I referenced earlier on. They really interest me, and I think Phyllis is one of our great writers. And if I could ever run a theatre, it would be staging second productions of new plays in this country, because I feel like we have this. One of the things that's great about new writing culture is we get to see amazing new plays all the time, but we also have this huge wealth of brilliant plays that were staged here in the 70s, 80s, 90s, noughties that don't get seen again. And I never saw the original production of Disappeared, but I'd love to see a production of it. She's such a great writer, and she writes character and language with such vivid energy, and she's really funny, and she's filthy, and she's sort of hides these really enormous ideas within raucous, beautifully observed, mad scenes. And I think that it's just a great story.
That sounds wonderful. I'm going to look that up, definitely. And it's a great point you make about seeing shows again. In fact, it's one of the challenging things, I guess, about our love for this live medium, is that once it's produced, where's the record? Can you see it again? Not until someone else produces it or read it. Which, and of course, this podcast, in its very small way, we're just trying to capture these things, keep these things alive and appreciate them. So we will do that for the Disappeared. Thank you so much, Lucy, for spending the time with me today. I've loved meeting you and talking about your play. As the curtain falls on the women at work in 2061, what do we feel about the prospect for their lives in the future? As they look to the sky for a moment, transfixed by the mysterious comet that flashes momentarily past, are there omens of change that they can set their hopes on? To be continued. Thanks for listening. See you next time.
Thanks for listening. To listen to other episodes, to find out news about future episodes, or to leave comments about what you've heard, please visit us at www.theplaypodcast.com. You can also follow us on Facebook or on Twitter at theplaypod. You're also welcome to email plays@theplaypodcast.com to suggest plays that we could talk about in future episodes. You can also register your suggestion on the website. Thanks again, and see you next time.